One of the first things to begin understanding in ZBrush to gain better proficiency is how symmetry works. In this little video, I will break down the methods of symmetry, how to activate and deactivate different axes of symmetry, as well as the difference between global and local, as well as local dynamic symmetry. From the outset, some subtools, when you start projects, like our default sphere here, have symmetry activated in the x-axis by default. If a subtool does not have symmetry activated, you can toggle X on and off to activate and deactivate symmetry in its basic plane, which is going across our x-axis. So it's mirroring over the z plane, but following the positive and negative x. You can find more symmetry options under your transform drop-down menu up at the top. If I pop that open, we'll get a little floating window here, and you can see when I hit X, it turns the symmetry on and off. So if you can't find the hotkey for this is where you will find the button. You can also see here which axis is being activated. You can deactivate and activate different axes. You can now see I have Y symmetry. I can also activate multiple points of symmetry. So now I have symmetry along my Y and Z axes. You can utilize this to your advantage. One of the other things that you can utilize with symmetry is the little R button down here, which is your radial point symmetry. Now I'm spinning around the Y axis and I have 8 points of symmetry. This can be fun and more situationally useful. Keep in mind, this is a non-universal setting inside of ZBrush. As soon as I switch over to a different subtool, there are different axes and symmetry points activated for each unique subtool. By activating X, you can see my symmetry is only set to its x-axis on the global. If I switch back to my previous subtool, ZBrush is going to remember what axes of symmetry I have, as well as any little modifiers like my radial point count. I'm going to reset this back to default. So I have global X symmetry. There's a large difference, like in many of our 3D programs, between global symmetry and local symmetry. ZBrush is no different. Right now, my project is set to global symmetry. What do I mean by that? If I deactivate symmetry and move my object in the world space to a different point along the x-axis and reactivate my symmetry, you can see the floating point mirrored across my screen is no longer centered on my object. That's because ZBrush has a fundamental action with its symmetry just over here in the panel called local symmetry. So it's just below the floor, just above your camera icon. When this is deactivated, ZBrush is going to work in world symmetry. So the 0 point is where all of my symmetry points will mirror across. I'm going to go ahead and activate X, Y, and Z symmetry. And you can see where my 8 points of symmetry are being activated. As soon as I turn on my local symmetry, my symmetrical points move back to the object. That's because when this is activated, ZBrush is going to look for where my pivot point on my widget is currently. Since it's currently in the middle of my object, my axis points are going to mirror on X, Y, and Z of the object in and of itself. As soon as I manipulate where my pivot point is, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my symmetry here, and then hold Alt and move my pivot point. If I press X again, you can see that even though I've told ZBrush to behave on local symmetry, the only thing that it's going to pay attention to is the pivot point center. Your axis is very, very, very important. In fact, if I rotate my pivot, you can see how that's going to affect my symmetry points. ZBrush's local symmetry comes with two specific modes. The core idea behind it is that it always pays attention to the center pivot of my manipulator axis. So if I want to reset this, the first thing to do is turn off my symmetry by toggling X and hold Alt. Alt is going to unlock your pivot. The little circular arrow button here is going to allow me to reset my axes and orientation. And either the home button icon or the little map marker icon will reset the center of my pivot. The first one will reset it to the center of the world, so X, Y, and Z 0, whereas if you hover over the map marker icon, you can read the tooltip at the bottom that says go to unmasked mesh center. There. Once I have that reset, I'm going to go ahead and activate my symmetry again, and you can see it's going to follow my symmetrical points. You may be wondering why I'm deactivating my symmetry first before activating the Go to Mesh Center button. Right? So currently what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave my symmetry on. I'm going to hold Alt and click Go to Unmasked Mesh Center. And what that will do is that will offset the pivot to the symmetrical location that is centralized by the localized pivot, which sounds kind of complicated. What that really means is wherever my symmetry is activated, ZBrush is just going to pay attention to that. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my Z and Y symmetry and go ahead and do the same thing and reset the center axes. You can see it's centering itself on the X volume so that where my pivot is now centered are the only points that I have axes. You can see after doing that, my pivot is centered on half of my mesh in X only. And because of my local symmetry, my symmetrical points are only mirrored on the widget in and of itself. So again, if I want to center my pivot without symmetry, I'll toggle my symmetry off first, recenter my pivot, and then turn my symmetry back on. I'm going to reset the mesh to the middle of the world with the little house icon. Without holding Alt, you'll move the entire mesh or the unmasked points. Holding Alt allows you to manipulate wherever you want this to go. But a recommendation is turn your symmetry off before you utilize the unmasked mesh center button. The home icon is more of a universal setting. Right? It will always set the pivot back to world 0, 0, 0 in X, Y, or Z. The last point of symmetry inside of ZBrush is a little tricky to figure out. That is local symmetry without rotational axes. So what do I mean by that? Well, right now, again, if I rotate this, if I change its location, whatever I want to do with it, even its scale, my pivot points are always going to follow the symmetry of my local axes, not just the location in the world, but also the rotation of the pivot as well. To deactivate this mode of symmetry, what you want to do is go over to the local symmetry button in your layout menu here and look for the little white dynamic text. ZBrush is notorious for having small little hidden buttons inside of its UI. Just like the floor, where I can activate grids on the X, Y, and Z axes, or deactivate them as I see necessary, I can turn on and off the local dynamic mode of symmetry. With it on, it's going to pay attention to the rotation of my pivot. With it off, it's only going to pay attention to the position of the pivot and not the actual rotation. You can see how that is going to affect my symmetry. For the most part, I usually deal strictly with global symmetry or local symmetry with pivot rotation. Turning off the dynamic mode can be advantageous, but you will almost always want your rotation points to be followed by your symmetry. One of the only ways to get this back to default, or at least back to a more easy to manipulate spot, is just to utilize your undo time. Your undo slider will allow you to take everything back to a point where it's familiar. And if you ever want to save some of the changes while retaining the original object, utilize multiple meshes. History is unique between my objects. Symmetry is not. But what I can do is I can keep the changes on one object, duplicate it, then take the original, and reset this back to my preferred default, and continue on.